Okay, all right. So we were looking at Manet, who is a member of this group called the Realists, right? And the whole point of realist art is to depict real life, and by that they mean contemporary scenes. Right? Now, people have done this in the past. We've seen it in 17th century Holland with the genre painting, right? But there seems to be less of an attempt to use those to mask sort of moral ideas. At the same time, they do address modern concerns, right? Issues that people are thinking about in the modern world. And they're trying to be particularly forward-looking. Not only in the subject matter that they choose, depicting modern Paris in its utmost modernity, in this case the train yard, right? We see the new houses back there. See those gray roofed houses on the right? Those are the houses that were put up during this renovation of Paris that we talked about under Napoleon III, under the direction of Baron Haussmann, right? That's part of the boulevarding of Paris. In fact, to this day, urban designers call it Haussmannization, right? Carving boulevards from monument to monument. And the train yard was sort of part of this broader overall plan, right? And so it's a particularly modern scene of modern life. But with that is also a particularly modern way to paint. And we left off, I was saying I should have had some details, so I brought them in today, to look at Manet sort of close up and see sort of this. So here, just to feed us in, right? This modernization of Paris is the thing that gave us these boulevards that we see here in this impressionist picture by Pissarro, the broad urban boulevards that are typical of Paris. And as we mentioned at the end of class, there was some backlash to this, and how do we interpret the subject matter in a Manet picture? Is it a positive thing or a negative thing? And a lot of people, such as the old musician in this acting troupe, were displaced by this renovation. And there were quite a few people, especially from the working classes, that could no longer stay in central Paris and were being replaced by sort of upper middle class housing. And that caused a number of social critics to say this is not necessarily the best way to go, right? So Manet's old musicians from his old neighborhood, been displaced, and he even depicts them as if they're sort of out wandering through the countryside, even though they're urban people, right? So as we interpret this, there is this one, on the one hand, there's this idea of Paris being modernized, and that might not necessarily be a great thing. And then there's, on the other hand, that Paris is being modernized, and maybe that isn't so bad. In that, because of the Franco-Prussian War, remember Bismarck moved in, wanted to kick out Maximilian III, not Maximilian, Napoleon III, right? Wanted to get him out of there, and Paris sort of held out and claimed independence from the rest of France. And there was a war that destroyed a lot of the city of Paris. Was very, very badly damaged during the Commune and the Franco-Prussian War. And so when we see buildings, new architecture, new Paris, there's a positive side to it as well. The country's getting back again, right? We're back on our feet. We're raising from the dead like phoenix from the flames, right? We've come back. And so even though this is before that, when we look at scenes of modernity, right? Scenes of modern architecture going up around France, we have to keep in mind that there are two different ways of looking at this, right? Spoiling the old way, or good, solid, industrial, modern progress, right?
Is the Paris Commune the attempt of Paris becoming independent?
Your hands are in front of you now.
The Paris Commune, is that Paris attempting to be independent?
They did try it for a bit. They tried it for about a year. And I think I mentioned this, but it might have been quick and in passing. But during the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans didn't want anything really. They didn't want to colonize France. They were trying to take it over. They just wanted, and it's Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, the leader of Germany, the Chancellor of Germany, he wanted Napoleon III out because Napoleon III would not let was trying to sort of stop Bismarck from uniting Germany, which at that point was a series of smaller duchies and whatnot. And Napoleon III didn't want another power in Europe to be as strong as he was. So that was his right? So Bismarck decided, heck with this, I'm going into Paris to kick this guy out of here, right? And install instead, or have the French install the kind of government that they've been trying for all along, which is democratic. Okay? When the Prussian army, Prussia is part of northern Germany, right? The Prussian army came into France. Most of France immediately surrendered. Right? But Paris said no. We are not surrendering, and we are declaring our independence from the rest of France. Right? This is 1870-71. A lot of people flee at this time. Monet is around at this time. He goes to England, right, to avoid the war. But one of his best friends dies in this war. Another painter, right? So the Commune is this brief attempt of Paris at being independent. What happened is when the Prussian army pulls back out and France elects its own government, it is the French government that goes in and stomps down the Commune to return Paris to the fold. So the bombing of Paris, the horrifying bombing of Paris, didn't come at the hands of the Germans. It came at the hands of other French. Right? But what it means is that after 1871, and our picture of the railway is after 1871, once we get to that point, when we talk about images of industrial progress, there's this old romantic idea that we saw with Constable, where progress is bad, traditions are good. That is tempered by an idea that progress might actually mean France is going back to a position of power, right? A position they can be proud of, right? Okay, so that's a longish answer, but it's important to sort of figure that stuff out. Okay, so now this is a particularly modern scene, and there are these questions about the degree to which Manet sees this critically or praiseworthy, right? And as a modern scene, he's also painting it in a particularly modern manner. And in fact, he got quite a bit of criticism for this. Because as we dive into Manet's works, what we see is something really we started with Titian back in the 16th century, which is that the paint, as you get close to it, it looks fresh, it looks wet. It looks like he hasn't bothered to sort of smooth anything out, you know? You can see the paint kind of hang on the surface of the canvas. So as we get into the bow of the little girl's skirt, at a certain point it looks like an abstract expressionist picture or something, right? And you become very aware, looking at it, that you're looking at a canvas with paint on the top of it, right? And we started to talk about this on Monday a bit, right? That Manet is often seen as one of the great innovators in modern art for exactly this reason, because when you look at pictures like this and you start to see, look down in the corner on the left, right? The individual strokes of paint across the surface, you become aware of this dual identity of the picture. That on one hand, the picture is a little girl with her nanny at a railway yard. In other words, the picture is what it represents. But on the other hand, a picture is an object. A piece of fabric with paint on it. And Manet's works equalize those two. We still think of it as a representation, but we also think about it as an object on the wall. You become aware of the flatness of the canvas, as opposed to thinking about art as a window that you see through. Right? Going back to the old Renaissance convention. And everywhere we look on the surface, we see this sort of unfinished look. Not blending any of the strokes. So we're just behind her hair here in the clouds. And you can see the degree to which Manet leaves it unblended. Leaves it looking like a sketch still. Like that Constable sketch that we saw, which was intended to be a sketch. And this became, for Manet, something of a problem with his critics. They thought he was making fun of them. getting them to look at a work of art that was consciously unfinished. They talked about his application of paint as being in patches. I think this is on the worksheet. Tache, right? The tache of paint, the patches of paint. And when we looked at the close-up of the model's face, you start to see that when we get in close, there really isn't, look at the sides of her nose. He's not modeled this, like, you know, normally when you draw the nose, you would draw the sides of the nostrils here, right? And you would make that the line that you draw. But you notice that there's nothing there? Right? There are these broad areas, and people said, I look at Manet's pictures and I see skin but no bones. Because as we get close, but when you back away, right, it works pretty well, because the shadow that's on the end of her nose here actually does establish the space pretty well. But you can see that he's very good about laying down these taches, these patches of paint to indicate the structure of the figure. I think they were a little bit unfair because you can really make out the bones. I love this detail, right? You can see these areas at the top of it. I wish, right? I used to paint. Don't you wish you could get a hand to look like a hand? And you can see he's really working the paint around the direction of the hand, right? It's just he's so sure with how he lays it down. But at the same time, these areas here, right, look almost like they're still wet, you know? And you really make out the degree to which he's just sort of slashing it down. And even the book, right? You can see the finger in the book here. And you can see the page of the book. And there's that one little splash of yellow in there. But it's just barely drawn at all, which is typical of Manet. And again, got him into some hot water with the critics. But it's a very, and the reason for that is it's a very, very modern way of painting. It's very untraditional. Right? Where the traditional way, the academic way, is to blend those brushstrokes. Now, people have made inroads this direction, right? We can think back to people we've seen. Van Dyck and Rubens, Frans Hals, Rembrandt. People have made inroads this direction, right? But it kind of explodes with Manet in a way that it hadn't before. And I'd be really sorry to show you the puppy, right? You have to see the puppy because he's so darn cute. And but again, these taches, these patches of paint, that he's very good about making sure that they don't violate the structure. You notice the white of the hair, the brushstrokes follow the structure of the puppy's skull. Isn't he just a doll? Isn't he cute, right? Well, now this comes more than 10 years into a career that was defined by criticism and conflict. Manet wanted nothing more than to be successful, to be accepted, to be praised for his works. But that almost never happened. Here and there, early in his career, he had a couple successes, and then he started being the sort of focal point of criticism for the sorts of things that we're seeing in the railway, which is this particularly non-traditional way of painting, not only in his choice of subject matter, but also in the way he puts the paint on the canvas. These two things were particularly untraditional. So when we started talking about the railway, we talked about the fact that some critics said, railway? Where's the railway? Because there's no train to be seen, right? So to call it something like that without having that be the subject of the picture, the subject of the picture is a little girl and her nanny, right? He's confounding us. And that became a problem. Now here, with the luncheon on the grass, the déjeuner sur l'herbe, right? Another sort of modern thing. What the heck is going on? We've got this lunch, right? We've got fruit in the basket. But the woman, for some god-awful reason, has taken off all of her clothes and just sort of thrown them in the corner. There they are. And hanging out with these two French guys, and they're talking about philosophy or whatever with the French do. Yeah? And almost paying no attention whatsoever to her. Right? Another woman in the back is bathing, so maybe that's what she's been doing as well. But there's something sort of risque about all of this. You know? You're there watching them, and she doesn't care. She sees you. Right? So she's looking right at you. And She's not trying to cover herself up. Right? And that shocked people. People were just like, this is wrong. And add to that the way that Manet paints in these sketchy patches. People said this is just too much. Now, 150 years later, it's not. But in the 1860s, when this was put on display, there was a huge outcry about how inappropriate this was in every possible way. That's not what Manet is trying to get across. What Manet is trying to do with the picture is to give us a particularly modern scene, a modern version of traditional themes. And we'll talk about that in just a second. The first thing is, the model is the same girl in both of these. It's his favorite model. She was a painter as well. None of her paintings survive. They might be one in Paris somewhere that they think is by her. Her name is Victorine Morand. She is by far his favorite model. She's in dozens of pictures by Manet. Our picture of the railway is the last picture he ever painted of her. Right? This one is one of the two that are the most famous that he ever painted of her. Both of them painted in the same year. The other one we'll see in just a second. Right? So this is posed in the studio. It's meant to be something, the luncheon on the grass, but what's going on here? Now, on one level, we could sort of argue that what Manet is doing is a sort of modern version of a traditional French scene. Love in the garden. Think Rococo painting, right? Boucher, Watteau, Fragonard, right? The swing. Modern version of that. We got people hanging out, and there's a sort of erotic undertone to everything. That's nothing new, really. But what's new is this confrontation. The fact that you're complicit, that she's looking right. And I think Manet loves this, right? He loves this face-to-face stuff. And he does it a lot, and it makes the pictures that much more engaging. Right? So that's part of the problem that people saw with it, is that confrontation, that inability to look away, if you will, the fact that it addresses you, and is unashamed with this display. I mean, it's a huge picture, too. It's a good 6 feet across, right? It's very, very large. Right? Another thing that people got upset about, let's see what's coming up. Oh, well, okay, the upsetness, right? He submits it to the Salon in 1863. Remember that the salons are being sponsored by the French Royal Academy, which still exists even though the royalty doesn't exist anymore. Right? The Royal Academy remains, and the salons remain, the primary place for artists to display new works. Had been since the 17th century. Remember, it was founded by Louis XIV, right? Still putting up shows, sometimes every year, mostly every other year. Okay? 1863 Salon, this goes in. This is one of Manet's submissions to the Salon, but it's a jury show, right? So there's a group of people who decide what gets in and what gets out. And Manet's work is rejected. Right? So are about half of the submissions that year. There are about 5,000, this is how big it is, right? The Salon had about 5,000 pictures submitted in 1863, and they rejected roughly half of them, around 2,500 of them. And there was some public outcry that the jury was being a little too strict, that maybe they should let more of these in. And so what the jury did in 1863 was to open a second show. They had the Salon, and then they had the Salon of the rejected work. The Island of Misfit Toys, right? And they called it the Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the refused works, right? And Manet's work then figures not in the Salon, because it was rejected, it figured in the Salon des Refusés. And it became an incredible cause. People made cartoons of it in the newspapers, mocked it, right, left, and center, because of all the strange things he does. Look at the perspective of the picture. Look at how close the woman in the back is, how small she ought to be being back there, and how small she simply isn't being back there. Right? There's a boat next to her that's totally out of scale compared to who she is, right? See the little rowboat behind the hat of the guy? And she's just like a monster back there, right? She's like Godzilla walking through the water, right? These things bothered them, right? right? It's like it's anti-academic. It's challenging traditions. And if you're a jury for the Royal Academy, which is the gatekeepers of good taste and academic training, that's who they are, right? They're the institution. They're the academy. They saw this as a challenge to their authority in every possible way. And that led to their anger, right? Their criticism of what Manet was trying to do. There's a close-up of her. We're not going to spend a lot of time looking at it because we're running so far behind. But nonetheless, there she is looking directly at us. The interesting thing when we talk about it as being a kind of traditional picture is that Manet is calling up image types that were always around. So I mentioned Rococo pictures of love in the garden, but that picture, which we talked about many, many weeks ago by Titian, hangs in the Louvre, right? It's in Paris. So he knows it. And that picture, we have two guys sitting in a garden with naked girls around them. Isn't Manet's the same thing?
Yes.
But what makes Manet's wrong and Titian's okay?
That she's looking at, yeah.
That she's looking at us as part of it, right? That's definitely it. She addresses you, which means with Titian's, they're muses, right? They're allegories. They're the personification of inspiration.
If that made people uncomfortable that she was looking back at them?
Well, because that means she's in your world, right? That means she's really there. Because these are the people, these naked women are sort of their inspiration. They're old Roman types where you personify ideas in the body of humans, right? That makes them safe, right? In addition to that, of course, Titian's safe because he's 500 years old, or in this case, 350 years old, right? That makes him safe. You get distance, Distancing makes safety, but this Manet breaks that down, right? So, but he sees it as a modern variation. And in fact, one could argue that the two guys, since they're not paying any attention to her either, right? Why can't she also be that? Well, because her clothes are there, right? And that kind of adds to it too, because are women, well, I guess they are clothed, but not really, right? It's just a sheet, not real clothing, not contemporary clothing.
You don't even see anything.
Well, yes and no. You could, but he didn't paint any nipples on the breast, right? You're right. And there's actually some talk that that's not really Victorine Meron's body, but some other model that he used because she's much thinner than that. And we'll see her in just a second, right? But yeah, there's the proper modern clothes down there. So this all makes it complicated. But what Manet thinks he's doing is following, we talked about this criticism as realism was getting started, that critics were saying, nobody's going to paint the modern world in France with the dignity that is due. The dignity with which we see ancient pictures being painted. And Manet is using these traditions to bring dignity to the modern world. Didn't work out so well, right? But that's the idea, is that he's updating traditions and showing that the kind of art that people consider to be great, Titian, we can make that kind of stuff today, right? In a very modern way. Yeah. In addition to that, the actual pose that he uses is based on a print designed by Raphael and carved by Marcantonio Raimondi, where we see three gods languishing on the side of the room. You can see that Manet has laid his models out as he's painting in the studio, based directly on this Renaissance organization. Now, the critics in the salon saw this, they recognized it too, and they thought that went along with the sloppy brushwork. We kind of like it, right? It's acting, it's great. But they saw sloppy brushwork, right? The conscious confrontation, and they thought that Manet was just having a good laugh at everybody else's expense. And this is why it was rejected. So by the time we get to our picture, the railway picture, Manet has a sort of fairly long tradition of running afoul of the critics, but he's not going to stop trying, right? Trying to please them. And wants nothing more than his works to be accepted into the salon and be part of the mainstream of art. He doesn't see himself as an outsider. even though that's how the critics want to paint him. There's Victorine Morant again, right? And you can see the body type's totally different. These were both painted in the same year. This one was submitted to the Salon 2 years later. I think he knew that might be problematic. 1865, and he knows it's going to be problematic, but he realizes or thinks that the status quo has got to change, and maybe he's the agent of that change. Like he's the one that can get modern art to be different. If we have a modern world that has changed so drastically in their lifetime, why should we use traditional art styles? Why not come up with something new, something modern for the modern world? That, I think, is behind what Manet is doing. And so he uses these to update it. Now, Olympia, Victorine Morant here, I had to show her because she's on her canvas side, right? So we couldn't skip her. I almost skipped her because we're running behind, but I put her in the same model in all three pictures that we've seen by Manet. Right? That's her. What role is she playing here? Notice she's looking right at you again, right? What social role does she play? Who is she? A prostitute. Exactly right. And you'll notice that she's receiving from her maid, her servant, a bouquet of flowers. Who brought the flowers?
Anyone, like a man.
Mm-hmm. But who, really?
I mean,
Yes, you. She's looking right at you, right? You have brought the... Has it made a difference? Does she give a rip? Right? And that's, I think, Manet, one of Manet's great strengths, and we saw this with the railway, is his ability to capture these expressions that are just like dismissive almost, utterly unimpressed, right, with what we've tried to do. But there she is, she's languid. You can even see she's sort of dancing one of her slippers on her foot, right? And she's looking directly at it. So this, of course, would piss people off even more, because you're not just the onlooker and being confronted. You're the client, right? You're the John, right? The prostitute's client who has brought her flowers, and she's not impressed. Cute little kitty. But it's also a funny little thing, because the cat's got its back up, it's angry, it's looking at you with its little yellow eyes, right? Almost as if it's hissing at you, it's addressing your presence as well, right? Normally, in a position like that, we might expect to see something like a dog, but we don't, right? And again, what Manet is doing is he's taking traditions and he's updating them. So we saw an Ang picture of an odalisque with a slave, right? That's part of the tradition that he's upgrading. But also Titian, going all the way back. I don't know if I should, did we look at this when we were looking at Titian, right? How close is that, right? Green curtain pulled behind her, right? Servants in the background. The cute little puppy dog replaced by the cat, right? In both of them, they play the same role, because Titian's Venus of Urbino is not Venus. That's just the title it came to receive later, right? It was, again, a picture of a courtesan, prostitute, a sexual, prostitute maybe not right, a kept woman for sexual purposes. Does that make sense? Right? Friends with benefits, right? Is what she is. And so she's also got flowers, right, that the viewer has brought through. Now, why, again, we go back to this question, right? Why is this one okay? And Manet's Olympia not.
Well, wasn't that one not okay? A lot of people had a problem.
Mark Twain hated it. He said it was the most lascivious picture ever made, the rudest picture in the world, right? And it has to do with the hand, right? And what she's doing with that other hand. But it definitely is a celebration of, the female body, if you will, a celebration of beauty. But it's also a rather randy picture. What makes it safe now is, I think, the 350 years. Right. if you're a late 19th century viewer, you look back at this and hey, it's okay, it's Titian. You know? We can look back at Greek sculpture, naked as a jaybird, and we go, not bothered by that. But if you saw a guy standing there, or a photograph of a man in the same pose as the Greek statue, that might be more bothersome. Right? Olympia brings it up to date. It removes any barrier between you and the subject matter. There's no safety net. There's no padding, right? That allows you to say this is okay. He breaks that down, right? He does that even further by the title Olympia. Olympia was the name of a prostitute in a fairly prominent novel. This movement that we've called realism, art addressing contemporary life, chronicling what's going on in the world with a sharp focus on the working classes, was also in literature in the late 19th century. And there was a realist novel about a prostitute's life. There were a couple of them, but there was one where the prostitute was named Olympia, and it was incredibly well known. There were others as well, because a prostitute is part of the working class. You see how it fits into the realist idea? We can even argue that the lunch or the grass fits in because it's people not working. And when people aren't working, that puts work into the spotlight. Leisure time. So Manet is this really fascinating artist. He's really trying to single-handedly yank art into the modern world, right? Doing modern pictures in a modern manner, choosing particularly confrontational scenes where they actually look and confront you, but then painting them in a way that nobody really had done in the same way before. Because I think he feels very much that modern pictures need to have a modern style, right? Now, he's painting right at the cusp of the beginnings of Impressionism. And Manet is often mistakenly called an Impressionist because of the way he paints. These unblended, choppy, sketchy brushstrokes is the way that people often define Impressionism. But that's not the best definition. The Impressionists were a group, 30 or so painters. Not all of them painted like Monet, although he was the one that's at the center and the best remembered of the group. By the way, on your final, don't write your O's so that they look like A's. If you don't know between, right? Make a choice. Monet, Manet. Monet is at the center of the group, but the group does not have a single stylistic unity. What they share is something that Manet started in a way, and that is a rebellion against tradition. But they took it a step further than Manet did. Manet rebelled against tradition, but he kept trying to exhibit his works in the annual salon, in the traditional official venue. The Impressionists did not. During the same period that Manet's works are getting rejected, so are Monet's. And so beginning in the late 1860s and continuing into the early 1870s, he and a number of other artists decided, heck with it. We are going to have our own shows independent from the salon. And the first one that they planned, 1874. March or so. Right? And they schedule it to open 2 weeks before the salon opens. Poke in the eye. Right? A rebellion. They rent this studio. It belongs to a photographer friend of Monet's. Right? They're going to display their works there. Monet and his friends. They invite Manet. Come join us. You're being rejected all the time too. Why don't you throw your lot in with us? Right? We will break the system. Manet says no. He is asked to join the Impressionists, and he says no. Right? He wants to go with the tradition. So whenever you hear Manet called an Impressionist, he had the opportunity to join this group. He didn't. Right? Now, they didn't call themselves the Impressionists. They were the Anonymous Society of Painters and Draftsmen or something along that line. Right? They got the title Impressionists because of this first show in 1874. When a critic looked at their works and said, these are unfinished. These are so sloppy, so sketchy, that they look like nothing more than impressions rather than finished, thoughtful works. You get the indifference, right? Well, they always say don't make decisions based on your first impression, right? Because impressions aren't thoughtful, right? They're more immediate. And so a critic looked at these and said, these look like nothing but impressions. And the name stuck, right? But it was intended as a criticism to begin with. So if we look closely at Monet, we can see why he might have said this. Look at how choppy the brushstrokes are. Right? I love it. I think it's fantastic, right? And especially Monet in this period is like my favorite. Monet in the 70s like floats my boat. Monet in the 90s I don't really care about. But it's this wonderful scene on the Seine. Argenteuil is a suburb of Paris. It's upriver from Paris, right? I guess it's downriver from Paris. It's toward the coast, but not that far away. These days it's kind of swallowed by urban sprawl, so you wouldn't see it like this before, or today. And Monet moves there right after the Franco-Prussian War because it's this place where the Seine River widens out. And he loves painting water. He built this little boat that he could float on the water with a studio inside of it. So he could actually paint while out there, right? A little flat-bottomed boat. And he captures the fleeting light as it bounces across the waves, right? This is what we most often associate with the Impressionists, is this interest in the changing, fluctuating, flickering nature of light. And as we look at this detail from Monet, you see how he captures that. If we look down in the lower right corner, we see a bunch of blue reflecting off the sky, but then you start to see some of the yellow reflecting off of the bridge, some of the green reflecting off the trees, and it's put down as a series of slashing strokes next to each other that aren't blended, but seem to capture the sense of a particular moment right at this one time. And by not blending the strokes, by leaving it sketchy, only adds to the idea that it's momentary. If he polishes it, that takes a long time to do. Now, these took forever to do, right? I mean, there's a myth that he's knocking these things out of there, right, just as quick as he can do. But they take a long time, and he starts them outside. We'll come back to this in a second. He starts them outside, because you had asked about that before, right? And he finishes them in the studio. And if you look at Monet's closely, you have a chance to do that because we've got them here, you can find that there are so many layers of paint that these are not dashed off. They just look like they are. He leaves the final surface to give you that sense that it's immediate. Because the overall theme of the picture is the changing of light. So it doesn't really matter what he's painting. In this case, this new bridge, the Highway Bridge at Argenteuil. That's not really the subject. The subject for Monet is often the light. And for this reason, he chooses the same subject and paints it over and over and over again. Not because he loves the railway bridge so much, although he might. A sign of progress. It's a new bridge, industry connecting Argenteuil to the big city. In fact, at Argenteuil, before the road bridge was put in, the train stopped on the far side of the river, and you had to take a boat across to the town, because the train from Paris didn't cross decades before Monet is painting them, there's a railway bridge and a highway bridge that are put in. Right? So this is progress, right? And if we look at the picture, it seems as if there's a sort of peaceful coexistence between the progress and the nature. That bridge is there, but it's being used by people for just sightseeing. Look at the people on top of the bridge with their binoculars. And notice how sketchy it is, but you still get the sense of them sort of looking out over the water, and then the rippling water of 3 different boats, 4 if we count the one we can't see, but we can see the mast of it in the foreground. Right? Everything's sort of existing peacefully together. It's a place you want to be in. I think that's part of the attraction of the Impressionists, is that it suggests an era of French history that everybody would love to visit at some point. Right? Now, the term impression came from this picture that was part of that original show, right, in 1874, Impression Sunrise. And you can see it's as sketchy as anything, right? In fact, large areas where you can see the canvas showing through the paint, upper left corner, for example, right? It's an industrial harbor. You can see smokestacks belching smoke, right? But again, he's interested in the change of light. Right. So what changes from realism to Impressionism? What separates this from Manet? 2 things. 1, painting outside and focusing on the change of light. Right? But what's shared here, an interest in the modern world, still continues. Now, our swanky $5 French term for painting outside is en plein air, in full light, in full air. And you still find that term used in art circles today, plein air painting, right? Painting outside. And going back to Peyton's question from about a week and a half ago, right? Why didn't they paint outside? Well, guess what happened in the middle of the 19th century? They came up with tube paint, right? 1840s or so. They came up with paints in tubes, and it became possible to go outside with a painting kit and dozens of colors and paint outside. Right? And Monet is, Manet could have, right? But he doesn't. Right? He's not an Impressionist. There's our bridge. You can see this interest in light. You'll notice that the solid stone of the piers of the bridge have picked up the color of the water, the reflected color off of the river, and almost are dematerialized by that. Right? So again, this is Monet's theme, and this is part of the reason why Monet often paints the same subject repeatedly, is in order to, because what is different about each one of them is the quality of light at the different times. So here's another one down in Richmond of the same bridge. So we're looking at the far end here, but from this side. So we're looking across this way, right? So we're on the other side of the bridge there and looking back. And you have to imagine that those houses that you see here are now kind of over your shoulder, right? Because you're on the opposite bank. But for each one of them, what he's trying to capture now is, again, the sense that the light is different on that day than it is on this day. He's walking around and focusing on these themes. At the same time, I think choosing things like industry as a theme that he repeats again and again and again under different weather conditions suggests a certain fascination with this theme, a certain fascination with industrial progress. And there remains, I'll get you in a second, Peyton, there remains in the literature a question about whether or not Monet thinks it's a good thing or a bad thing. His cute little town that he's moved to has been invaded by industry. And there you can see the railway bridge behind it, right? Go ahead.
Why does the sky just stop? Or is that part of the painting?
That's the shadow of the frame. You're talking about this bit up
Yeah.
here? Yeah, that's just
So
the shadow of the frame.
Okay.
I took this picture, right, as the lights were coming down this
No
way,
problem.
right?
Just-
So It doesn't stop until you get to the edge of the edge of the canvas, right? I didn't take the one on the left because it's never been out since I've lived here, right? That's not been on display since I lived here. Okay, so Monet is kind of the centerpiece of this movement called the Impressionists, but he's not the only one. Like I said, there's roughly 30 artists. We're going to look only at those artists that were painting in the style of Monet, which is this broken brushwork that looks speedy, looks hurried, right? That captures a fleeting moment of life. But we'll see that within that, there's kind of a range of things that people can do. Now, before we go on, something I should have brought up before, because when I had the Impressionist name up there, it had a date, right? 1874 to 1886. The group mounted only 8 shows over the course of 12 years. We can do the math. There was not one every year, right? 1874 was the first one. 1876, 2 years later, was the second one. Then 1877, and so forth, right? The last Impressionist group show, 1886. Anything after that, they still had careers. Monet lived till 1920s, right? Are not part of the Impressionist group per se, right? So, but we'll be looking at artists that were part of that group. I should mention as well that it was not a single membership, okay? There is not one artist that was in every single Impressionist show, not even Monet, right? It was a revolving group, right? There was no sort of membership, right? There are people that are associated with it. And within that, they didn't all paint like Monet. But for this class, we're going to look at the ones that did, right? The guy that came closest to being in all of them was Pissarro, Camille Pissarro. I think he's in 7 out of the 8. And his subject matter is different from Monet's, but the technique is similar. He, too, is interested in trying to evoke the idea of a momentary visionary experience. Right? You're just seeing something that happened and is over as soon as it happens. And what we're seeing is the effects of weather, the effects of seasons, right? A particular moment. But subject matter, he's less interested in water. Monet loves water. He loves the fleeting nature of life. Pissarro, still the modern world, but he loves rural villagers, right? Rural farmers in the outskirts of Paris. So he's much closer to the realist movement, which was also focused on workers, particularly farm workers. Pissarro maintains that. He belonged to a leftist political party that believed in trying to give more political and social rights to these people. And when he depicts images of village life, which he does most often early in his career, they're incredibly idyllic. They're just peaceful. These are the working classes in the fields, and even when he shows them working, they don't seem like they're working all that hard, or if they are, it's not such a bad thing. Right? So in this case, we see a couple chatting, leaning over a fence, a woman going off to market, maybe, we don't know for sure, but it's just sort of a calm, peaceful existence. They're in harmony with nature. Some of the ideas that we can trace back to even Romanticism, Constable, are still on display here. But the style and the group identity, for what it's worth, make him an impressionist, right? He's part of this group that are exhibiting in these 8 major exhibitions in the 70s and 80s. And the technique, as you can see, it has that same sloppiness that the critics would have called sloppiness, that you and I call assuredness. Right? And they're wonderful. I think if you ever want to paint, you should go down and start looking at these things, because how do you paint a tree? Right? I always found this fascinating. It makes me want to go back and paint again now, because going up to Portland, we didn't have that great a museum. Now you can go down and you're like, well, how how am I going to paint a tree? And you realize that sometimes you have to paint the sky after you paint the branches, you know? And all their solutions, everything you're ever going to come as a problem as an artist, you can solve by sitting and looking. Right? And great, and your tax dollars at work. Right? And go see them live. Let's see if I have detail coming up. I don't. I have another picture by Pissarro. So he loves these little towns on the outskirts of Paris where people, even if they're working, in this case they're gathering up sticks during this in this orchard field and certainly hauling things around, stooped over. But you get the sense that it's harmonious, that there's nothing particularly wrong with any of this, and that's typical for Pissarro's works, right? But again, part of this group, part of the central core. Another artist who's part of the core is Degas. And Degas has particular themes that he focuses on as well. He loves dancers. There's dozens, if not hundreds, of images of the ballet in Degas' work. Who's working on Degas? Two of you, right? Literally hundreds of these. A theme for him. And in fact, when Degas was asked, because he was part of the group, right? He exhibited in the first show and some of the later ones as well. And when they said that, what's it like to be an impressionist painter? Oh, that's the question they asked. But they basically asked him about impression. He goes, "I'm not an impressionist." He said, "There is nothing impressionist about my work. My work is very deliberate. My work is very thoughtful. It's not impressionistic at all." And he said, if you want to label me anything, you should label me a realist. Because again, the dividing line between realism as a movement and impressionism as a movement really centers around a very limited number of things. Were they part of the group? Did they paint outside? Was fluctuating light an important theme for them? These are kind of the core issues. Everything else they share. Modern world. Modern approach to painting. Right? These things they share. So for Degas, can we say it's a fleeting sense of light? Even though we're inside? We see it coming up off the boards. We see the shadow of the girl on her points there. The way the light wraps around and diffuses. We see a certain broken brushwork in the tutus in the foreground that capture the sense, the gossamer feel of that fabric that you can see through. You can almost hear this picture, right? The shh of the dresses as they move, right? All of these things put him sort of with the Impressionists, and he's definitely part of the group, right? But different from the rest.
I was just going to say, if he really didn't want to be considered an impressionist, why did he allow himself to be associated with them?
Why did he allow himself? They were friends. That's a good question. I've not looked into it enough. Do either of you know why did he stay with them if he didn't like the label?
I'm not sure.
I think part of it is, Emma, that he saw himself to be, okay, back up. If in the 1870s you are going to be an avant-garde artist, what do we mean by avant-garde? Right? Head of the pack, right? Avant-garde literally means the front troops, right? So you're the first assault on new territory, right? The avant-garde leads the troops into the new territory. If you see yourself as an avant-garde artist, then you're going to want to pair yourself with a group that is abandoning the traditional forms. So that would have been very, very attractive to him, that idea of pushing art in that direction, right? And like I said, the group really was much more varied than your calendars give it credit for being, right? Your refrigerator magnets and whatnot, right? We tend to sell Impressionism as being this very core, unified group where everything kind of looks like Monet, right? But that's not really the case. So when we come back to Degas, one of the things that we also, when we look back at this, is difficult for us, is to understand that ballerinas in the 19th century were not prima donnas. We're used to ballerinas being artistes, having a sort of certain social status, right? Who's that woman that's now the the lead dancer with the Metropolitan in New York. But they get status, right, for being ballerina, means something. They were grunts. They were called theater rats in the 19th century. I mean, this was hard work, right? And they usually came from very impoverished backgrounds. They were poor girls who had no possible way of making money any other way than the ballet. And they would often have a sugar daddy who would support them, who could actually come backstage. Degas gives us this sort of backstage pass, right? Because if you look at this picture, there are no men there, right? Except Degas, by insinuation. He has inserted himself into this very private place, seeing the ballerinas not on stage as performers, seeing them backstage getting ready to perform. And for Degas, I think that's a really fascinating thing about Degas, is there are three basic themes that Degas does all the time. Ballerinas, big surprise, prostitutes, and maybe more of a surprise, race horses. He loves these things. And each one of them, there are dozens, multiple dozens of images. But with each of them, whether it's race horses, or prostitutes, or ballerinas, he shows them getting ready for the thing that they're trained to do. So we see ballerinas going through the motions, not on stage, but warming up. We see race horses futzing around before the race. We see prostitutes bathing in between gigs. And in two of the three, the two that involve women, they are places that he really shouldn't be. Watching a prostitute bathe, right? Without the makeup on, if you will. So, Degas presents us this sort of really fascinating case study. Now, what do I have coming up here? I don't know if I'm going to get through Degas, but there we can see the degree to which he loves this theme and repeats it throughout his career of catching them with their guard down. She's sitting on a cello, right? You can see the cello behind her in the foreground, and it's sort of like, there's a psychological drama with that. But catching, tightening up the bow on the back of the dress, practicing moves and lacing up their shoes. Thank you. Yeah. So we'll finish Degas. We'll finish up this and move into Post-Impressionism on Monday. Again, if you hit any horrible hiccups on your paper over the weekend, don't hesitate to email me, right? And I'll get back to you sometime over the weekend with answers to that. But good luck as you're trying to pull that stuff together.